Right. So let's talk about legs a little bit more. I mean limbs, forelimbs and hind limbs. There's some concepts or terms we should go over so you kind of can add them to your mental toolkit of when you're designing animals in terms of feet and limbs. And we'll talk a bit more about ankles and stuff too. Here's some of the subjects we'll cover. Okay, flex limbs. I know we've covered this a little bit last week and also a little bit in the free webinar, so I don't want to go into too great of detail, but there were some explanations we skipped then. We've talked about how some animals have knees that cannot straighten out ever, or at least not more than once in the life of the animal. I should point out that that's true in the forelimbs too. Animals like this don't have elbows that straighten out all the way. And then there are animals that are straight limbed. The technical term is graviportal. And they can straighten out the knees all the way. They tend to straighten them out less the faster they move, but they can indeed do it. And of course they tend to have long upper elements, short lower elements, whereas flex-limbed animals tend to have longer lower elements. Obviously a big kind of pudgy for a flex-limbed animal like a horned dinosaur has relatively shorter lower limb elements, but still much longer than in like an elephant. And then there's some weirdos, which I don't want to actually cover in too much detail right now, but things like cats and to a lesser degree dogs can actually straighten out their knees and their elbows. This guy isn't quite perfectly straight because the upper leg bone starts here and goes to the knee and then comes down, but cats can actually straighten that knee essentially all the way. And they actually do it during locomotion, in part because of how by flexing the back up and down, especially at fast speeds, it changes the leverage of all the limb segments. I just did want to say that outside of animals that this is basically left over. See, remember the whole mammals spend 2/3 of their history as little tiny things hiding in holes or going up in trees, basically more squirrel-like or rat-like things. The result of that is that mammals actually start from the odd position of having really flexible, straightenable limbs and then have to sort of fix it, if you will, if they want to get quote-unquote proper big animal leg structure for flex limbs. And as a result, there's a whole series of middling mammals that they'll certainly flex their limbs while they run, but they also do weird things with their back to come up with unique solutions to allow it to straighten out and be useful. Or I should say to take advantage of the fact that it's already straight rather than having to like change it. That seems to be a mammal-specific thing, so if you're designing a mammal-like thing, there's no harm putting that in there, although it does have locomotory changes that like your rigger and TD artists would need to be aware of in the back and in how they run overall. But by and large, we're going to concern ourselves with true flex-limbed and true straight-limbed or graviportal animals. I mentioned before that being straight-legged is not related to how heavy you are per se, but rather how much locomotion costs. That is, if you don't have to run, you can make it cheaper. The reason for this is pendular motion. I hope you all know what pendulums are. There's a whole bunch of fancy physics that basically says if you have a largely frictionless pivot point, that basically you take it to a height and gravity will accelerate it and it will keep moving. It'll be free motion. It'll go almost up as high on the other side, and then it'll come back. Rather than going over the physics, I'll just point out that this is why grandfather clocks are designed the way they are, because they have a very close to frictionless joint up here. Once you move it, it essentially continues on moving and therefore counting seconds reasonably accurately for a very long time. That free motion is what allows elephants, when they walk, to not have to lift the feet very high up off the ground. In fact, you'll notice they flip the wrists back quite extremely in the forelimbs just so the rest of the arm doesn't have to hardly bend at the elbow or shoulder at all as it comes forward, allowing it to work as like a true pendulum with like a little flippy part there at the wrist. But even the hind feet really never lift very high off the ground as they move, as opposed to, say, a horse, where, of course, as they move or even as they walk, have to lift the feet up quite high off the ground. And there are reasons why they do that. Part of it is momentum, since they're moving faster. But there are design implications of this. Oh, this is also true, I should point out, of flex-limbed dinosaurs like this allosaur, which had to lift its feet quite a bit higher off the ground in order to clear the drooping toes. But as a result, animals with straight limbs tend to have heavy feet or big lower limb elements because that actually helps the pendulum-like effect. Whereas animals that have to lift their feet up high that have flex limbs tend to do everything they can to either reduce the size of the feet. Ungulates like deer and horses obviously have kind of had an amazing success at making the feet smaller. But they'll also try to move the muscles up as far as they can to not add extra weight further down the limb, which is probably why dinosaurs go with the whole drumstick thing. They're probably taking as much leg muscle as they can and shoving it up their leg to get the weight up there closer to the point of rotation so they don't have to do as much lifting when the leg comes up here. So that's kind of the whole, exactly the mechanism why flex-limbed animals can't walk as cheaply as columnar-limbed or graviportal animals. But of course the downside is that these guys lose all leverage for running and they don't have good angles in a lot of places where they're trying to move fast, whereas animals like this inevitably have a higher top speed. And why even really big dinosaurs with flexed limbs, whether they could truly run in like a giant suspended phase or not, are certainly moving faster than an equivalent sized animal that has straight limbs. So like a sauropod and an elephant that were the same size would probably have a roughly similar top speed, but something like a horned dinosaur undoubtedly could have gone faster than an elephant at the same size because of those flexed limbs. How much faster? I don't know. Certainly open to debate. Okay, so let's look at feet a little closer. We're going to look at digitigrade versus plantigrade. That is, some people walk on the bottoms of their feet, while other people walk on their toes, or even on their tippy toes. Obviously, this lady would normally walk like this, but is attempting to walk up on her toes. So, plantigrade. That's the condition we have, where our ankles are on the ground. Yeah, Charlie brings up a good question that's actually worth talking about here with pendular motion. Yeah, the sort of normal condition for people prior to like cars and buses and economies is to have to go gather over large distances. And yeah, in particular, female Homo sapiens did a lot of gathering. And of course, both genders did a lot of hunting. And all those activities require long foraging areas. And so humans seem to preferentially favor cheap walking over maximum top speed. Which, you know, makes sense, because primates in general don't outrun almost anything unless they can do it through the trees. Okay, I do want to point out real fast, if you're designing an alien creature, a fun thing to do is to first come up with a foot design and then try to imagine what you could do for footwear, because I assure you that if like some sort of alien archaeologist in the future were looking at our feet without any clothing knowledge, they would probably not come up with this design off the bat for like the obvious solution. I mean, this lady is totally digitigrade and walking on her toes here with a little bit of support. So really, if you're coming up with an intelligent creature, an intelligent alien species, you know, probably any animal or creature with intelligence is going to have issues like fashion if they have genders, assuming you're not making a animal that reproduces asexually. They're going to have genders, they're going to have fashion, won't necessarily mimic ours at all, but a really fun way to get creative with your design is to start out with the anatomy first and then be like, well, how might they try to emphasize features or bend that design around in order to like let their designers, their little alien designers, come up with interesting ideas for spacesuits or creature fancy wear to go to formals or what have you. Okay, so let's talk about the grades here specifically. If you want to write these down as notes, these are names that unfortunately are not the easiest to replicate with simple words, but there are animals that walk on their heels. They're plantigrade. Primates tend to do this. Well, I'll show you some more things that do it. We do it. There's a digitigrade-like stance where you're walking on your toes, Cats and dogs do this. Most dinosaurs do this. And then there are animals that are what are called unguligrade. And that's because the ungul is a name for the last claw or hoof that you have on your fingertips. And these are animals that are walking on their toe tips, not just their toes, but just the very tip of the toe at the end is on the ground. And these are all totally valid strategies if you're coming up with a creature. You can use any of these. They do have some benefits. As you might imagine, flex-limbed animals that move fast do well at this end of the spectrum. Animals that are not so fast do pretty well at this end of the spectrum. Animals that go in trees do particularly well at this end of the spectrum. Here's a quick demonstration for you. This is a bird. Remember, its thigh is up here, the knee's here, that's the ankle. It's standing way up on its toes, its ankle's up there, and to help visualize that, here's that bird actually in a plantigrade pose. A lot of birds actually rest this way, especially ground birds or birds that spend a lot of time on the ground and have really long legs. So again, you have the hips back here where you can't see them under the wings. The femur probably is actually going up slightly to about there. You're going to have the drumstick hidden up here again by feathers of the body and the wing. And this is the shin coming down to the ankle, and now you have the ankle and the toes on the ground. Does that make sense to everybody? I know we've already talked about bird knees bending the right way and the ankles being up high, but is it easy to see with this comparison? I'll take that as a yes. But there's almost always an exception when it comes to feet. Like sometimes I'm like, well, these rules really always stick, like say stiff backs needed for longer necks. With feet, there's a rule broken for almost every single example I can give you. Bears, for example, are fast. Don't try to outrun a bear if you see one in the wild. It's not going to work for you. In fact, you really can't even outride a bear on a horse most of the time because bears can accelerate to a top speed faster. And yet bears are totally plantigrade. They're plantigrade and they have short lower leg elements. They look like they ought to really be kind of slow and clumsy, and yet bears are the opposite if they're hungry and you are their intended object to get. I've already told you most primates are plantigrade. They also vary depending on their locomotion between having huge palm areas for both the feet and hands, and having really long toes and short palm areas depending on how they're crawling. Crocs and lizards also are very, very, very plantigrade. Sloths on the ground are plantigrade in the hind feet, Tom. I believe they actually, at least some of them, fold their knuckles over and walk on their hand bones, make them essentially knuckle walkers when they move out on the ground, and that's in fact I think what ground sloths in the past did also. However, when they climb and hang by suspension, they're mostly gripping with their fingers, so they'd be equivalent to plantigrade in that pose because their wrists and their fingers often touch it. Elephants look like they should be plantigrade, but it turns out they are most definitely not. This, of course, is the ankle bones, the foot bone, this is the toe bones, and you'll notice that really it's just the toe tips that come down in elephant feet. They're essentially unguligrade, although, of course, they're backed by this massive pad. If you're a little grossed out by that one, here's an example of just a CT scan. Notice how, like, the toe tips, and then parts of the toes come down, so you could call them a digitigrade if you want, come down, and then they have these massive fleshy pads sort of visualized partly in green here behind it. So they're really walking on their toes, and in some cases their toe tips, on top of a large fleshy pad. Now interestingly, dinosaurs sort of do this on the hind legs in a lot of animals. They'll walk on their toe tips but have a fleshy pad, but their their hands, if you will, their forelimbs, don't do anything of this sort. For reasons we don't quite understand, it appears that essentially no dinosaur figured out a way to put pads behind their hands, which inevitably wrap around in sort of a horseshoe. And so dinosaurs of all types, if you look at them from behind, have these hollow spaces behind the hands when they walk on all fours. And this is one of those cases where we really, it doesn't look like other archosaurs, like crocline archosaurs, had massive fleshy pads behind their hands either. So it might be that fleshy pads on the front leg is sort of a take it or leave it situation. We know mammals do it, and mammals do it in several separate lineages, so it shouldn't be too hard, and yet there's tons of lineages that don't do it. There are dinosaur lineages that develop this, horseshoe, empty back of the hand thing totally separately from one another. There's 3 or 4 of them, and at least 1 or 2 other archosaur lines that do it that aren't dinosaurs. So while we don't fully understand why you would be able to or not be able to do it, it seems like you really can pick and choose if you want. And this would be another great way to get some cheap design differences. If you're starting from a dinosaur-like animal, you could add maybe a fleshy pad on the back to make it a little bit different. And if you're starting with a mammal-like animal, you could add the empty horseshoe-like circular structure hand in order to get a very different look to your mammal-like creature. Just a few more interesting feet. Camels, of course, technically are supposed to be ungulates, but they really walk more digitigrade because these toes are totally backed by large fleshy pads. I point this out because you can combine them, and you should, depending on what the reasoning is. For example, animals that live in the desert often add extra padding, as these camels do, because it spreads out the weight. It's an easy way to get a whole lot of weight. Now, of course, you don't have to do it this way. You could imagine, for example, that horses that live in drier environments could simply enlarge the size of the hooves. So there's 2 totally different ways you can start from a pretty similar position and end up with the same functional solution but a very different look. This is crazy. This is an ostrich. That makes it a dinosaur. It's desperately trying to be an ungulate. It's actually lost the claws on one of its toes. It's totally lost the other toe. Bye, Brooke. And so they run on just 2 toes, and mostly just on this one strong center one. This outer one is kind of the equivalent of our pinky toe, where it really just functions to help provide a little bit of balance. Another really weird thing about this, and I want to say this is weird 2 or 3 times maybe, is that they also run up off what I would say is their sort of toe heel. Normally in other dinosaurs, this part here, where the ankle hits the toes, would be flat on the ground. In fact, do I have an emu here? I do. You can see it comes down, and this actually has pads behind it. These guys are raised up off the ground so that even less of the toe is contacting it. They're really trying to be horses or deer, if you will, while standing on 2 legs. And the reason I want to say that this is unusual is because I've been seeing a lot of dinosaurs, theropods, drawn without the ankles on the ground. Well, not the ankle, but without the base of the toes, the part that makes sort of a functional heel, on the ground. And I think it stems from this, people looking at ostriches. But this is weird. Normally, the toes are on the ground in most all other three-toed, theropod or other dinosaurs. Okay, so this nonetheless is a cool example. I mean, if you think about it, 3-toed theropods appear in the Triassic. So they've been around for 200 million years. 3 toes are almost always a great solution. Look at how many birds still use it totally unmodified, including other ground birds. And yet ostriches, working to really up their top speed, presumably to escape competitors, like all of a sudden, after like untold millennia of not significant change, have radically modified the foot into this like 1.5-toed, single-clawed, extra toe bone up off the ground, bizarre but very cool foot, which allows them to like be even faster and also save on even more weight while they're running quickly. Okay, I do want to have one other bit of discussion here. I mentioned before that she's, this girl is making herself have extra limb segments and kind of walk on her quote-unquote toes. And you'll often see a solution like this when people have to dress up like fawns in movies. And you might also notice that no matter how good digital fawns are, no matter how convincing the CGI fur is or what have you, that they really never look all the way convincing, especially when they move, when they're starting or stopping. And here's why. The classic fawn design is like fatally flawed. People want to attach the fawn deer-like lower legs from the knee to the digitigrade or unguligrade ankle down to the toes to human knees, and that means, and here's the key mistake, that the human leg, femur, upper leg, the thigh, is usually left essentially straight up and down. And that fundamentally cannot work. And indeed, if you go back and look at deer legs when they're standing comfortably, that's a good example, they're flexed. That was a sheep, but it works the same way. That is the normal condition for flex-limbed animals. And so the problem here comes from the fact that they're attempting to take a flex-limbed lower leg and not compensate in the upper leg. Now you could use a human-like thigh, but really this forward position here needs to be the default position in your pose. And you can see people, there's a reason why people in these designs frequently have canes, and there's a reason why you often have connections running up here to help compensate and basically cheat to try to provide more straight up and pulling back support for the persons, because they're literally trying to move in a way that those limbs are not built to work. So if you want to make an effective fawn or fawn-like animal, there's a lot of fantasy creatures that combine various cloven-hoofed or single-toed hoofed leg designs into more humanoid torsos. Please design them with the idea that the thigh, the leg, is going to be more forward all the time, and then go back, and that'll allow the foot to naturally sit below or even slightly in front of where the torso comes down. Another solution I've seen, which also does not work well, is some people try to solve this to get the feet under the body but not move the thigh forward by bending this really sharply out and really sharply back. And that just creates a whole other mess when you try to animate them, because it's just not a feasible way for real animals to move. So I hope that is a clue if any of you find yourselves doing satyrs or fawns or what have you in the future, or if you're ever on a fantasy movie, you can fix this. You can make it better, and it will still look like a fawn. It's still going to have, deer-like lower legs. You might have to change a little bit about the shape of the hind end in them, but you're already doing that usually when you CGI the legs onto it, so I don't see how that's a major problem. You also might want to actually, if you do that, have the equivalent of the ilium come a little bit more forward, meaning that the iliocostalis muscles, you might want to start more on the front and have them curve around to the back to help support the back as those legs move. Those would all be good functional ideas, and if we had a class just on solving this problem, I would give you skeletons and muscle diagrams, but unfortunately we don't have one. We talked about ankles, I think in the webinar, either the webinar or the first week, but I did want to remind you another very clear difference between mammals, it was the webinar, between mammals and dinosaur-like things is that mammals, and actually crocs also, have these big protruding parts of the ankle, whether they're digitigrade or plantigrade, that are sort of the equivalent, if you will, of the funny bone, the olecranon process on the ulna, which all animals have sticking out to some degree. And they stick out quite a bit, which gives them leverage. And this is a classic mammal and or croc-like ankle, which can be totally swapped with a more bird or dinosaur-like ankle. Whenever you see fit, you could exchange one for the other in order to get more design freedom in your mental toolkit. So that's why, of course, when you look at this, not only does it have a dinosaur thigh and a mammal calf, it also has a very clear mammal ankle before transitioning to a more dinosaur-like foot. So let's recap this before moving into the real nitty-gritty. First of all, drumsticks belong on dinosaurs. not mammals. Oop, that's supposed to be KF, not FK, which sort of sounds kind of funny, actually. Sorry about that. There are several ways that you can construct feet and hands. Creatures can walk on their heels, or they can walk with their wrists down on the ground also. Animals like crocs, bears, people all do this. Creatures can definitely walk on their toes. T-Rex, dogs and cats all do this. Or they can walk on their tippy toes, like, you know, horses, deer, and to some degree elephants, although of course they sort of cheat by having a massive pad behind it. Additionally, that, oh, I already covered the fleshy pad. And there's a fleshy pad, as I said. But for reasons we don't fully understand, dinosaurs and even their relatives seem to lack that fleshy pad on the back of the front feet, leading to an interesting horseshoe-like hand configuration where the back is always empty without a fleshy pad. Dinosaur hands look like they're more structurally strong because those hand bones often fit tightly together, giving them sort of like a half I-beam, if you will, for like front to back motion when they're moving. So they're probably pretty good for limited front to back motion in big animals. They would suck at being flexible for getting around in trees or climbing down holes. But nonetheless, we're not sure why they do this and why they can't come up with fleshy pads. But certainly switching fleshy pads in and out to your design is a great way to get variation with your mental toolkit. As a general rule, although there are exceptions, straight-legged animals frequently, to take advantage of pendular motion, have large, heavy feet, and their lower legs in general tend to be stouter, often with muscles extending further down the leg segments, whereas flex-limbed animals often attempt to do the opposite, to make their feet relatively light if they can, and to scrunch the muscles as far up the leg as they can. It's probably actually one of the reasons why deer and horses favor more heavily muscled thighs and more lightly muscled calves. Dinosaurs, of course, have heavier muscled calves, but they tend to bunch it up as far as they can into like drumsticks. So it's kind of two different ways of solving it, depending on whether you have a special drumstick muscle arrangement or not. And before we go into the final nitty-gritty segment, I would like to stop here for any questions. If you have any questions, go ahead and shout out a yes, or I'm typing, or even raise your hand if you have a mic. It can be on anything we've covered so far. I am looking up the Pan's Labyrinth fawn design right now because I can't remember it offhand. I remember really liking the movie. I guess I must have if I didn't recall the animal design offhand. Crazy. But in general, the thighs need to point more forward.
And Scott, if you really broke that design down even more, since we're working in 2D or 3D art, how much more will we have to, let's say, adjust the pelvis or the spine to really make a, realistic representation of that?
Yeah. Okay, two parts to this. One, looking at Pan's Labyrinth, the sculptures I see still are not bringing the thighs far enough forward as the default position, like as the I'm just standing doing nothing position. I can't recall how it's animated in the movie if they changed that, but looking at the previous sculptures here, they don't seem to start out with the thigh kind of angled forward to the knee enough. But that's an excellent question. And what else would you have to change if you're going to go a real Pan's Labyrinth? Let's go with an all-out sort of satyr or fawn character rather than just a human glued on. And in that case, you would definitely want, I think, to extend the hips, both the bones, the ilium, and the muscles, which are the part you would be sculpting, of the hips kind of up the sides a bit more, in part to give better leverage for holding the legs comfortably and moving them in that more forward position. And as a result, you also you could almost get away with flattening the buttocks, for lack of a better term, a little bit more compared to the human condition also, because with the legs forward, basically those muscles are going to get stretched around further in their natural position, meaning you'll be able to have more muscle bulk there without having to make it look like a linebacker in football. So those are two obvious changes, and that I mentioned, but it would reiterate, as you extend the sort of thigh muscles and pelvis up the sides a bit, that would also cause me to want to make the iliocostalis contour both more prominent and start a little bit more forward on the hips before it curves up and around into the back.
Cool.
You could curve the back a little bit more. I probably wouldn't. You could, though.
Like the lumbar area?
Yeah, the lumbar area. You could get away with that for sure if you wanted to. It's not necessary. But the final thing I was going to say is there's no reason why we have to be so flat front to back in our torso. If you think about how wide side to side and flat we are, that's more of an accident of our history. So if you're starting with an animal with cloven hooves that probably doesn't come from the same history, you could totally make it more barrel-chested if you wanted. It's not necessary, but it would definitely give you some room to kind of make a unique-looking animal.
Yeah, so take the ribs, instead of the wide point, on us, it would be more like a, let's say, dog.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, draw the sternum forward and give yourself, yep.
Cool.
Yep. Again, not necessary, but it gives you a bit of freedom. You could even, if you wanted, move the shoulders around. I mean, so they're more on the sides a little bit at least with that barrel chest.
Yeah, that's just the whole cool thing about, once you start, knowing all this stuff, you can just really start moving things around and getting, not the stereotypical designs that we're used to seeing all the time.
Yeah, actually, I really want to go do this now. Not now, but
Yeah.
seriously.
Gotta go, guys.
I'll catch you next week. Okay, so with no other clever questions then, let's look on to the rest of the stuff.